relates to my seminar. Okay. Well, good evening to everybody, and it's good to be here. I thought I'd start this evening by just talking a little bit briefly about how I came to this topic. I live in Melbourne and I have a private practice in Melbourne, and one of the ways I was surviving the first lockdown that we had here way back in March was I decided that I would walk to work. It's about 3.5 k's from my home to my office, and that way I'd get some daily exercise and also get a break from being at home. And on my way I'd listen to podcasts, and on one day coming to work I happened to be listening to a podcast with Krista Tuppett who on Being, and she was interviewing Pauline Boss on ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief. And something about the podcast really grabbed my interest because Pauline Boss was talking about things like disturbed moods, underlying melancholy that makes no sense, an inability to focus on tasks even when there's plenty of time available, and a sense of powerlessness. And she was relating this to this characteristic of ambiguous grief. And it made a lot of sense to me, and it helped me understand more fully my own experience during this time, and also the experiences clients were more and more frequently beginning to share with me about their experiences. So since listening to that podcast, I've shared this idea of ambiguous grief with my clients, and they found it quite useful at a number of different levels, which I'd like to talk about a bit later in tonight's session. So tonight it's my intention to explore our experiences and those of our clients during this COVID period and pandemic, and how some of their experiences can be understood in relation to this notion of ambiguous loss. And I'm also going to be interweaving this focus with an exploration of what's happening in our bodies as we share our experiences. Grief, and therefore unresolved grief, which is an essential part of ambiguous loss, occurs in our bodies, of course, not just in our heads. And the more we can pay attention to our somatic experiences and work with them, I think the more chance we have of resolving some of this unresolved grief. So just a moment, I'm just going to share the screen. So disabled attendees, oh, Carmen, can you enable me to share my screen? It seems like you've disabled it.
Oh, okay, sure.
No. Still saying it's disabled.
Okay, try that now.
I'll try it now. No, it keeps giving me the same message.
Sorry, you've moved out of co-host.
Ah.
That's why.
Now I'm
right. You should be
okay.
able to now.
Okay. Great. So Pauline Boss is a emeritus professor at the University of Minnesota, and in 1999 she came up with this notion of ambiguous loss, and she gave it this name because at that time she was working with veterans, soldiers who didn't return from war, or children who went missing from their families, and they never returned, and families never knew what happened to them. But in some of her definition, I think you can see why I'm applying it to our experiences with COVID. So she said ambiguous loss is a loss that occurs when there's no point of closure, and no end point or closure, and it often results in unresolved grief. It can refer to someone or something having a physical absence and a psychological presence, or a physical presence and a psychological absence. And it can also refer to the grief we experience where a situation is chaotic or out of our control and we have no mastery over it. And I think there are a couple of factors in this definition that are very relevant to our experiences of COVID. It's a loss that occurs without an endpoint or a closure. And I think that's one of the most troubling things that I found clients are struggling with at this stage. None of us know how long this pandemic's going to last, if it will ever completely go away, and what are the long-term implications of it for our lives. And more importantly, I think it's out of our control or mastery. It's something that's happened and it's not our fault. I mean, if you really want to go global, you can say it is our fault. It's a consequence of generations of us ignoring a lot of things we probably should have taken notice of. But on a more day-to-day basis, none of us have actually done anything to create the COVID. And so we have a strong sense of powerlessness. And we don't have a clear understanding of its full implications. And I think the other thing that Boss describes is that it's the most difficult loss to bear for us in Western society, where we place so much emphasis on mastery and solving problems. And we really hate it when we have to struggle with things that are mysterious or things over which we have little control. So we keep, and what she said perpetuates our grief, is we keep searching for answers and we keep searching for solutions rather than just sit with and face and experience the grief of the loss. And in doing so, we delay the process of grieving, or we postpone it. And that's why she says we end up living with unresolved grief. Another aspect is there's nothing tangible to grab hold of. I was working with a young man this morning, and I was just talking to Carmen. I'm going to talk about him in a little bit more detail later in the session. But he said, I wish there was something I could grab hold of, and then I would know that there was a reason for why I'm feeling this sadness. But the depth of grief I feel just doesn't make sense. And of course, if it doesn't make sense, we think we don't have a right to grieve for it. Brené Brown, in a podcast I was listening to last week, it was talking about a day 2 experience, where she says we'll do anything to try and address a situation without being vulnerable or without experiencing the emotions that are attached to the situation. And I think a lot of that is going on with clients today. I think probably what best summarizes it in some ways is this statement from David Kessler, who also works with the grieving process. And let me see if I can move it on. It's not moving. Screen. We're in a grief process, a world grieving for what we had and we didn't know we had it. And I think that's what's striking many of the clients that I'm working with at the moment, is that they're very aware that they're in a grief process and they're grieving all the things that they had in their lives that they took for granted, whether it was just going down to the local coffee shop to have their regular morning coffee and to be able to sit there and have their coffee. In Melbourne, we can't even do that. We can only do takeaway. And that reminded me again of something that Pauline Boss said when she said, once you are attached to something, you can't just turn off your attachment. And, you know, I think we get attached to all sorts of small things that we didn't take for granted. I know I used to come to work on public transport. It's only 10 minutes on the train. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed seeing the other people on the train. There was always some character that would, you know, be entertaining for some reason or another. And I remember that was one of the first things that I felt sad about losing when lockdown started, and I started walking to work instead of coming by the train. So what are the characteristics of common experiences and expressions of ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief? Well, these are some. You vacillate between hope and despair. And in Melbourne, I think this is very much got associated with numbers. So, you know, around 9 o'clock every morning, we get the latest case numbers. And you can almost predict what clients are going to be like that day. Because if the numbers have gone down, there's hope. If the numbers have gone up, there's more despair. This young man I was working with this morning said the same thing. He says, within a day, I seem to go up and I'm on a roller coaster of feelings. You robotically do the basic tasks, but there's a way in which you're not really engaged with them. You're not really embodied, I'd say, from my perspective. So you do what you have to do, but you're not really there. There's a level of unsafety that you begin to feel in yourself and you're not quite sure why. But it's really because the rest of the world is sort of a bit unsafe, I think. Someone referred to it as it's like an incremental death. The reality is the same, but life is not the same in that reality. So, you know, I look out my window and the park and the trees and the cars are all still there. The trains are still running, the trams are still running, people are still walking down the street, but life is not the same as it was. And how do you get your head around that? There's a lot of conflict between discussing your grief and minimizing it. So this young man that I was working with this morning, you know, at one stage in his session, he said, look, you know, this is really a minor problem, really. I'm in a relationship. It's a good relationship. We've got a home. We've got food to eat. I can come out into the garage here and do my exercises and study. You know, why am I feeling such depths of sadness? That, you know, there must be something wrong with me. There can be heightened anxiety and phobias. Some people have reported a capacity to only focus on getting through the next minute or the next hour. This idea of planning seems to have completely gone out of the window. As I mentioned earlier, there's disturbed or roller coaster mood states. There's an underlying melancholy that makes no sense, you know, just a heaviness, and you don't quite know why. Some people have reported brain fog or an inability to focus. And there's a sense of powerlessness or what's the point? And I think the powerlessness is very much related to, I haven't done anything that consciously, you know, and yet I can't stop this thing. And so why invest in anything? And of course, there's often extreme fatigue. And I think the fatigue is often associated with this unresolved grief. If you can imagine, if you're holding in your anger or your frustration or your sadness or your fear that's associated with your grief, that uses up a lot of energy. And so it's not surprising to me that you end up feeling quite fatigued. And as this young man said this morning, I just can't do it anymore. I just can't keep pushing myself to do this anymore. So that's a very quick and rapid summary of this notion of ambiguous loss. So what I'd like you to do now, or invite you to do really, is to break into your groups. And in your groups, I'm going to ask you to do 3 tasks. One is to have a look at the body, the questions about your body, and just rate yourself very quickly on what you're aware of happening in your body, as we've talked about this even in this first sort of 10 minutes or so. And then I want you to share as willingly as you're able, and given this is a short seminar, what losses have you noticed during this period? And what are you grieving? You know, there may be losses, but you're not grieving them, but there may also be things you're grieving. And how are you expressing this grief? How are you experiencing it? But I think particularly, how are you expressing it? Is it in your thoughts? Is it in your actions? Is it in your emotions? Is it in all of it? And as you do share that with each other, notice what happens in your body, and notice what happens in your body as other people in your group share their experiences. So we're going to have 15 minutes for that, so that you, it'd be good, I think, if someone took charge to keep a tight time, depending on how many people are in the group, so everyone gets a chance to share something. And we'll see you back in about 15 minutes.
Thanks, Narelle. And everyone, just a reminder, please switch on your video, your cameras, so that you can see each other, and make sure your mics are unmuted. You'll get a notification when there's a 60-second countdown for the end of your breakout room, and you'll come back into the session. Thank you.
Had a sort of productive time talking in their groups. I know in our group we did about some of the losses we're experiencing and the impacts it was having, and the impacts it was having on us somatically as well. I thought what might be useful before we break out again was to talk a little bit about ideas I have about how we might heal some of this unresolved grief. And so I should put up this next slide. So as I said, I found it really interesting when I was listening to these podcasts, because it really helped me understand my experience and that of my clients, and it gave me a label, if you like. I was not alone. This was a common experience. And I found that just talking to my clients about there being such a thing as ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief seems to have assisted them in a very similar way. And then I think sort of an empathic acknowledgement of the emotional experiences that go along with this, some of those things that I listed earlier, has also been really important. The multitude of responses, rational and irrational, that I and some of my clients have experienced felt like they were being validated, and that seems to have helped them as well. You know, not being sad for a silly reason. But I think although I gained a lot listening to the podcast and getting some insight into the process, and although it helped validate my experience, I've noticed that for me, I only really seemed to address some of this grief when one day, quite out of the blue, I was sitting in my office. I had an hour or so to spare, I think, before my next client. And I suddenly allowed myself to just have a very deep cry. I just sat on my chair and I just sobbed. I had no idea what I was sobbing about, but I just sobbed. And I realized as I was crying that sadness had been building within me over a period of days. So it'd been this sluggishness, if you like, that had just been taking me over. Everything was getting, you know, not exactly robotic, but lacking joy. I didn't know why I was crying. I just knew I had to cry. And afterwards, I felt a bit tired and I went on to do my sessions. But the next day, a lot of my energy had come back. And I think observing my clients, I found that this last aspect, this enabling people to express their grief, has been the thing that's been most healing for them too. My experience is that most clients don't find it easy to cry at the best of times, or to express their anger or their frustration or show their fear. And especially if they think there isn't anything tangible to be crying about or be angry about or fearful about. And COVID, of course, is like that. And I think also there's a fear and a misunderstanding that's still very pervasive out there in our culture, that if I really cry deeply about something, it means I'm depressed, which of course is quite the opposite. And so I found myself a lot in these last few months explaining to clients the difference between expressing your grief in the form of crying and being depressed. And so I think what it's validated and reinforced for me is the importance of an embodied expression of our feelings, that it takes more than insight or acknowledgement to really heal this unresolved grief. As I mentioned earlier, this young chap that I saw, he's in his 30s, today was an example of it. He was telling me that he was, when he first came online, he just looked tired. And I said, "Oh, you're looking tired today." And he said, "Yeah, I'm just having a really hard time." And then we talked about what was contributing to his hard time. And, you know, he just ran off a few things that didn't make a lot of sense. And then he said, "Oh, I'm feeling really, I'm really missing my family." His family lives interstate. But there's nothing I can do about it. So, you know, no point in feeling sad about it. But as he said that, you could see some sort of tears coming into his eyes. And then I asked him what else he was feeling sad about. And he said, university. He'd enrolled to go to university this year. And he said, "I'd really been looking forward to it. I'd been really looking forward to getting together with the other students and, you know, having exchanges of ideas and meeting in the cafe and doing things like that." And he said, "All I do now is I just sit online." And the more he talked about it, you could see the sadness was coming closer to the surface. Now he's worked with me for a while, so I know his process quite well. And as I said earlier, I do somatic work. And he's got a tendency to sort of, you know, tighten up and push his way through things. And so I said to him, "Have you got your mattress there?" Because I encourage my clients to bring mattresses and pillows and towels and all sorts of things to their services and sessions. And he said, "Yes." So I said, "How about you just lie down on the mat?" And I was going to get him to do some movement, but as soon as he just let himself surrender and lie down, he started sobbing. And he just sobbed very deeply. Every now and then he said, "I don't know why I'm crying so deeply about this. You know, it's nothing to cry about," and kept trying to discount it. But I just kept encouraging him to just stay with it, that things had just crept up on him. And the most important thing was that he felt his sadness. And afterwards, you know, he got up and we were able to talk about it. And he talked about how he felt that other people had worse off situations than he had. And there were plenty of other things that people could have been talking about rather than him. And that he'd had this heaviness around him for days. And he thought it was just a matter of him just getting over it. He just had to find some way to get on top of all of this. And, you know, I suggested to him that the longer he tried to get over this grief, the longer it was going to persist. And that I didn't think, that's right, he had this idea that everyone else was mastering it. Everybody else was finding ways to make this a good experience. So what was wrong with him that he wasn't? And I pointed out that there were many days where he was actually doing quite well. And this just happened to be one day where he wasn't. At the end of the session, he said he started to feel much better and he was looking forward to doing some more study. So to me, that was just an example of, we started off, I'd never talked to him really about ambiguous grief before because it hadn't really come up in his session, but we started talking about it as a valid thing. And I was able to acknowledge his sadness, but then I was also able to encourage him to actually express it. And I think it was really in the expressing of it that his body freed up. And one of the things he said to me, he said, "Well, what's the point of that anyway? It's not going to change anything." And I said, "No, it's not going to change your situation at university. It's not going to enable you to visit your parents and your extended family, but it is going to free up your body. It is going to free up your energy. And you're already feeling that you're not so weighed down and heavy." And I think that is some of the advantages of encouraging people to give expression to what is happening for them. So in this last breakout group, which we'll probably have about 10 minutes for, again, I want you to pay attention to what's happening in your body, your cells, but share what's the hardest aspect of unresolved grief, whether it's fear, anger, sadness, that you find to encourage in your clients, and pay attention if you're not quite sure what you noticed happening in your body as you did that. And we'll come back in 10 minutes and have a few questions. Topic, but I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask in relation to anything that